And I hope my voice is audible and everything is clear.
Yes, sir.
Fan-
Yes.
And fantastic, fantastic. So thank you all for having me over. It's such a pleasure. It's wonderful to meet youngsters who are so excited about law, who want to learn more, and it's a fantastic thing. Before we get on the root of the matter, so to say, talk about the mistakes in cross examination. I just like to say this. There's a story that a senior lawyer once told me that you can learn more about law from one big matter than 100 small matters. I've been very blessed to do some phenomenally big matters in India. Uh, and so I not only learned from the best, but also learned in some of the best matters. So the tricks in those matters are on much higher scale. The judges are prepared, the prosecutor is one of the best, and the kind of preparation that you get into in this matter is very huge. But to prepare for that one big matter, you have to, and that is what the senior said, you have to be prepared and do those 100 small matters very well. So that if you're prepared with those 100 matters, you'll be able to do that one matter very, very well. So it's a very basic thing. What I'm going to do is, if you're like me, what you would like is bite-sized information. And that is what I propose to do, because the whole idea would be that, I'll give you a small pointer, and this would be devoid of, sections and judgments and all of that. Not too much of it. I'll of course give you certain landmark judgments or judgments that I have used in court, but I will not really get into much of the theory of it, but get more on the practical of it. So without any further delay, the topic is very interesting. It is about mistakes that young lawyers make during cross-examination. It can be on the criminal side as well as on the civil side. Uh, the effects of those mistakes. What would happen if there is a delay in cross-examining the witness? And also, what would happen if there is a delay in examining the accused himself? Now, all of you know that the accused is examined under section 313, which is one of the major, so to say, pointers or one of the major achievement or goals in any criminal prosecution system. In a civil system, of course, the petitioner or the respondent or the defendant would come to the court to give his side of the story. If he fails to do that, there would be certain implications, because only he or she would be able to take his case forward and prove his case. Uh, we will also quickly also discuss what happens when false information is done. And I would be talking about another aspect of it, because I've been a defense lawyer for more than 20 years. Though I've been as a special prosecutor in some matters, but as they say, the soul is that of a defense lawyer. So I will basically tell you the other part of the story that judges usually don't talk about. And if you're on the defense side, you might want to take this forward, because I've been speaking about this in various forums. The general mistakes in law. We know that cross-examination is one of the most effective weapons in the arsenal of any lawyer. The fact is that cross-examination is never to be used just to confuse the other side or to confuse the case, which is something that a lot of people have said. A lot of people usually try to confuse or intimidate or browbeat the witness. Frankly, that's not a really good strategy. And why isn't it a good strategy? Is because when you are cross-examining the witness, you need to have judge the judge on your side. You need to make sure that the judges give you the kind of indulgence and leeway. And they will seldom give you that leeway if they feel that you're browbeating or you're harassing the poor witness. There could be situations where the witness himself would be a problematic witness. These witnesses usually are either police witnesses or witnesses who are in the government service, or those witnesses who see in the senior management, or those witnesses who feel that they're entitled to some power. Those witnesses are to be dealt in a different way than other witnesses, and we are going to deal with that. But first things first, what are you to do to be good at cross-examination and how to avoid certain major pitfalls? The first is, we have made some PowerPoints, but I'm not really good at it. So we'll
You can
avoid
share.
it.
You can share it. You can share it, sir. There is an option downstairs, green color, share screen.
Yeah, I know that, but it wasn't happening while I was talking to you.
Sir,
Uh,
I have activated it for you.
doesn't matter. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. It doesn't really affect my, uh,
Sir,
discussion.
first open the PPT and then go for share screen. You might get that option there. First, open your PPT on the laptop.
Yes, I have the PPT on the laptop.
Open it first on the laptop and then open the Zoom. You will click on the share screen. You will get the PPT downstairs in some folder.
Okay. Have we managed it?
Yes, sir. Yes.
We have it on the screen?
No, abhi right now we are not having it on the screen.
All right. Let me just try it once again. If it doesn't happen, we'll leave it and.
Sir, it's come. Sir, it has come. It's fine.
It has come. Lovely.
Yes.
Brilliant. All right. So this is where we were discussing right now. Yeah. So the first question is, what would be cross-examination? You guys have already heard this, so I'll not waste a lot of time. This is, go through section 154. And the whole idea of cross-examination is to bring forward the truth. Now, truth always has three sides. Now, this is the defense lawyer talking. It's always your mind and the absolute truth. The idea is to bring forth your truth. The absolute truth is something which is very theoretical. We don't know what it is. But what we do know is that irrespective in a civil matter or in a criminal matter, the other side is bringing their version of the truth. And it is your job to bring your version of the truth. So it's an extremely strong weapon. The pitfall that you would have is when you're not prepared. So pre-preparation is one. Always, when we talk about pre-preparation and not preparation, what we are talking about is know the general law. So know your Evidence Act, know the general law in which your matter would be. For example, civil matter, CPC, criminal matter, CRPC, IPC. Know the general law. Then know the special law, the statute, if there is a special statute in which your matter is coming, 138, for example, or when we are talking about, on the civil side, for example, matrimonial cases, or when we are talking about family cases, know the special statute, because all of them would have certain special requirements of cross-examination. Then always know your facts. Somebody once told me that you may falter on law, but you can never afford to falter on facts. The moment you falter on facts, you've lost the quote, and you've lost, so to say, the chain of thoughts. The moment you lose your chain of thoughts, you've got yourself in a big, huge hole, and it's very difficult to come out of. So know your facts. A very important thing on the criminal side, a mistake that is done, is when the file comes to you, and this is, we will also talk about civil side, but this is more for the criminal side. When a file comes to you, the IO in the charge sheet has put the site plan, and you've gone through the site plan and you're very comfortable with the site plan, and you think you can cross-examine and take on the world. You cannot. Somebody once said the map is not the territory, which basically means that the map could even be to scale, which it isn't. But you will not really know what really is happening till the time you do not go to the site and you inspect the site. I remember many years back, I was doing a matter, for a terrorist organization. The case was that the terrorists had come to ISBT and had planted, or were attempting to plant, RDX there. And in that case, they had made the site plan of ISBT and had said that, the accused had come out from such and such place, had entered from such and such place. Interestingly, this case was fabricated. Interestingly, what had happened was that there had been fresh construction in ISBT. And this is really old, when you did not have the flyover that now comes to Tisazari from Trans Jamna. So that flyover was being constructed. And so when we went to the site, we were shocked to know that the site, the plan was completely different from what was the ground reality. And we actually managed to win the case on that point majorly. Because when we cross-examined the IO, the IO wasn't aware of this fact, and we were, and we had got our photographs done and all of that. Now, if you can't go to the site, even if you can't go to the site, then also please check out Google Map and a lot of other technologies that are there, because when you are able to do that, it will just be easier for you to prepare your cross-examination. Now, when the file comes to you on the civil side or the criminal side, irrespective, prepare your charts, which means write down the allegations which are there against you, or the story of the other side, how they're trying to prove it, if there is a document which is connected or not connected, if they have other witnesses that they're talking about in the narrative, or if it's a criminal case, in the list of witnesses, and the civil side, if they've disclosed those witnesses. So get your narrative right. The moment that is right, you would be very confident about the file, about the case. A lot of lawyers tend to make notes on the front, on the index. I tend to use a copy, a notebook for each and every case. I would suggest you do that, because then there is much more to write and to assimilate and to prepare, etc. Also be very, very aware, this is pre-preparation, that you are aware as to who the witness is and which document is filed and which witness is going to come and exhibit that. So one, there is a narrative. Second, the narrative has to be proven by the other side by a witness and document. So once you have the narrative right and you put which witness will be called for which narrative and which document will be there, you will also know whether that witness is competent to exhibit that document or not. And the moment you are aware of that, you are also going to know where the weakness of the other side is. So it is very, very important. The second part of it is know the prosecution story and know your story. Or know the other side's story and know your story. You are always going to make mistakes if you are not aware of the other party's story, but more importantly, if you're not clear from the very beginning what your case is going to be, what your story is going to be. Because you cannot have a meandering cross-examination. And the moment you have a meandering cross-examination, you will never be able to prove your case. So extremely important to know what your story is and always remember to follow that story. One of the biggest mistakes that most of the lawyers do is they have a general idea about their story and then they go to the court and then they start cross-examining the witness and they think, "Arey, I can probably take my story there as well." And so what they do is they digress from the story that they've created. They come to a completely different story. And then another witness comes and they, "Oh, this story does not work." And they try and come back to the previous story. It doesn't work like that. You know, you would always confuse the court. You will always confuse the witness. You will always confuse your own story. You will always have a problem on the defense side or when you are finally arguing your matter, irrespective whether it's again a civil matter or a criminal matter. A very important thing that I would like to share with you that is usually not spoken here in India, but something that I learned when we were doing a matter abroad, and we had some of the best lawyers in the world on the other side. This was an arbitration matter, but it was a fantastic learning experience. What it said was that know your long game and your short game. Basically what it means is that when you are getting up and cross-examining a particular witness, know exactly what you're going to cross-examine. What do you want from him? If you don't need anything important, don't cross-examine. Don't waste your time. Don't ever get into a fishing and rowing inquiry. The moment you do that, you will create a mess of your entire case. All right. So very, very importantly, what you're supposed to do is prepare the short game, know what questions and what documents the other witness is there for, and the long game. The long game is your entire story. So you know the entire story and you've chunked it out into smaller bits as to, okay, this is a fact I have to get proven from this witness. This is the witness I have to break to make sure the chain is broken, etc., etc. And the long game as to what your story is going to be. So always have a short game and a long game in your mind. Note it down. It is always going to help you. Then, very important again is not having the complete command of the case. Again, as I have seen in a number of matters, what usually happens is that a lawyer reads the file peripherally and says, "All right, I will deal with it when the time comes." The time is before you go to the court. You should be aware of the case, every witness, every document, and therefore the first advice, make your charts before you go to the court. Another big mistake that I've seen a lot of lawyers do, and this is not just young lawyers, this is also very established lawyers, that they don't prepare their cross-examination. A lot of lawyers like to be cowboys. They go to the court, they know the overall story, and they say, "Arey, khel lenge, we'll manage it." You can never manage it. The most depressing thing that can ever happen to you is that you go to the court and you ask the questions that you're supposed to ask. And then when you come out of the court, after some time, you remember, oh, I could have formulated my question like this, or I could have asked my question, this question, which I didn't. And that's the most depressing thing. So always write down your cross-examination. And I'll tell you a wonderful strategy for preparing your cross. Two-pronged approach. One, first write down what you will never ask the witness or witnesses. Make an entire list of questions that you will never ask. Now that you know that the points you will never touch, you now can prepare the points that you're going to touch upon. Fantastic idea to ensure that you do not mess up your cross. The second is, always understand that any question can usually have three answers. Yes, no, I don't know, or I don't remember, right? So your question, how you make your cross, is on this three-pronged approach. If you want the witness to say yes, so the question is there. If he says yes, you finish that question. Don't again be a cowboy and think, oh, I'm going to ask him more questions. Let's see where it goes. It will go down the drain. If he says no, you have your next question prepared. Or if he says, I don't know, you have your next question prepared to close the loop, to get him to say what you want to say. The second most important thing is that at times a witness might not answer the way or react the way you want him to react. So you again do not keep pushing him at that time. If you have prepared your case and if you have prepared your cross-examination, you would know that this is the moment I stop asking him these questions. I will change track. Either you start asking him question on some other fact, or you should have some FAF questions prepared. FAF questions are not questions which are irrelevant, but questions which are very general in nature that do not really or cannot really harm your case. So that after 5 or 6 questions, when you have had your bearing and when you know that the witness is sidetracked, you can bring back the questions. So again, very, very important. Secondly, you should always write down the exhibits that a witness will do next to the witness itself. The moment you have that, you would know that this is the kind of, just a second guys, right. So you would know that, all right, these are the documents which necessarily have to be exhibited by the other side. Also, when you read the law, understand the concept of primary evidence and secondary evidence. The moment you have the concept of primary evidence and secondary evidence, you would know what documents cannot be exhibited by the other side. That's again extremely important. Another huge mistake that that a lot of lawyers do is that they're not vigilant reading the affidavit of evidence or when the chief examination is going on. A lot of leeway is taken while exhibiting documents, which could be again secondary evidences, photocopies, or documents to which the witness is not a witness to and therefore could not have exhibited. So be very vigilant at that stage so that you do not let the other side get one over you. The moment they have that one thing over you, they've already strengthened their case and you weakened their case. Supreme Court has said that if an objection is not taken at that very instance, then at a later or an appellate stage, you cannot take that defense that this document could not have been exhibited. So be prepared. It is extremely important. Another thing that I would like to tell you is, that's one of my favorite. A good lawyer knows what to ask. A great one knows when to shut up. So as a good lawyer, you have your cross prepared. You're asking those questions. If you got what you want, and if you know that this is what I was seeking, stop exploring, shut up. If you ask that one other question and the witness explains it, all your hard work has gone down the drain. So therefore, failure to set goals is an important aspect where a lot of mistakes are done. So set your goals, prepare accordingly, and thereafter, the moment you've got what you want, shut up. Don't ask another question. Don't explore. Don't get into, a fishing and rowing inquiry. A lot of young lawyers believe there cannot not be too much of cross-examination, where there of course can be. Another very important thing is that when you write the question down, ensure that you get the shortest possible answer. You let a witness explain himself. He will explain himself to kingdom come. You have a huge problem sorting the mess that you've created once you let a witness explain away his case. So therefore, if a witness is still, one of those die-hard witnesses who are hell-bent on explaining their cases, you shut him down. You say, I have asked you a specific question and therefore a narrowly tailored question. I have asked you a specific question. You please answer that, and whatever rest you want to say, you can say it as a volunteer statement. And a volunteer statement doesn't come from you. It's a statement made by the witness. It will not be harming you the way, a normal question ka answer would be. Now, so when we say narrowly tailored question, another aspect is that never ask a question without knowing its answer. If you don't know the answer, don't take a chance of asking that question. It is only going to create a lot of problems for you. And and the problem again would be that the witness would start explaining himself, and you would have a lot of problem thereafter in your final argument to collate what is required and what is not required, because the other side is going to, of course, use it against you. So don't ask questions without a purpose. Very, very important. And now a very practical aspect of cross-examination. In the youngsters' language, put your game face on. Put your game face on means that when you are going to cross-examine someone, you are taking on an avatar. It is not you. It is not you, the nice, docile person, or that angry young man, or whosoever, whatever your personality is. Your game face is dependent on the witness that is coming. A very effective way, of course, is that you are extremely nice, sugar-coated. The witness feels extremely comfortable and says, "Arey, he doesn't know too much. He's such a nice guy or a nice girl." And he starts rambling, and you can get him to say whatever you want him to say. That is one way. The other is that you put pressure on him by being very overbearing. There is a problem with that because judges don't really appreciate that kind of cross-examination, but there's a trick to it. And the trick is that the moment you are overbearing and he reacts, you turn to the court and you say that, "My lord, please ask the witness. I am an officer of the court. Please ask the witness to behave himself. Please ask the witness to answer the questions." The witness, my lords, is answering back or retaliating, or my lords is not, my lords, talking properly or whatever. The moment you point it out, you take away the fizz from that witness. The witness knows that, he's in the court, he's not the boss, and that, you at this time are controlling the game. So put your game face on, very, very important. Now, another important mistake is not knowing the law of exhibiting documents. As I've said, primary and secondary evidence, electronic records, read section 62 of Indian Evidence Act. I think that is going to help you. But very, very important, you should be knowing what documents can be exhibited, what cannot be exhibited. If you get something that could not have been exhibited, you created a huge roadblock for yourself. Also now, when you read the other side's case, always know what he has admitted, because if you're going to touch what he's admitted or something that he's left out that is going to help you, that would be a professional harakiri, isn't it? I mean, somebody has already given you prasad by he not actually saying something that he was supposed to say to take his case forward, or admitted something which helps you. And in cross-examination, you ask a question and he explains himself out of it. Well, it's a harakiri. You created a mess. You were given blessing and you've rejected it. Again, as I said, know the law of evidence. Again, hearsay is a huge thing. A lot of times witnesses are brought in who heard somebody say something, and and that becomes an evidence. again, that's hearsay. You have to bring the source witness or the source document. That's basic law. So again, uh, understand the fact, the what the Evidence Act is, what the laws pertaining to exhibiting documents, etc. are. Never argue with your witness. Show him who's the boss. The best way to show him who's the boss is that if he starts arguing with you, point it out to the court. The court is any which way is busy. They really don't want a rambling witness. They want the witness to, say whatever he's supposed to say and get out. You can use this to your advantage. Point it out to the court. The moment you point it out to the court, the judge is going to, it is then between the court and the witness, and the court is going to take care of the witness. And you've shown that you're the boss. At this moment, you're the officer of the court, and nothing else is more important. Just point out his demeanor to the court. The court is going to take care. One more mistake, very important, is that you have to learn to deal with facts, not with conclusions. If you ask if the cross-examination is, in your opinion, what do you think? The moment you ask that, you've opened the Pandora's box. You really don't know what the witness is going to say. And the fact you do not know what the witness is going to say is going to create huge amount of problems for you, right? Expert witnesses is another pointer where a lot of youngsters make a mistake. The trick with expert witnesses is to use one's intellect against the another, which basically means either if you have to cross-examine an expert witness, get another expert witness to make your cross-examination for you. He's going to tell you exactly what the loopholes in the other expert witness report is, and that's going to help you create a good cross-examination. Also get your own witness. You counter one with another. In your time, get your expert witness. If you can, it is going to discredit the first. Never ever attempt to attack the expert's opinion head on, because you really don't know how he's going to explain itself. He's of course an expert in this field, so he knows more than you, but you're an expert in cross-examination. So first you go round about 3 questions to know the depth of his knowledge. The moment you think that you have an inroad, drive through, break his cross-examination, break his evidence, discredit him. Excellent. Now, another thing which a lot of people make a mistake is they let the other side ask leading questions from their own witnesses. Now, we all know leading questions is basically putting words in the mouth of the witness. You or the other side can never ask leading questions from their own witness. The opposite side, of course, can. So you should know this because it's an extremely important thing. I would ask you if you've already been told, good. Otherwise, pertaining to leading questions, I would suggest that you read section 141, 142, and it would actually tell you what is the leading question, and again, what happens when you ask a leading question. So 142 will say that a leading question cannot be asked, and unless and until the other side does not object to it, etc., etc. There are 2 judgments to it, which I would suggest that you note down and you read pertaining to this. It is going to really help you. When it comes to leading questions, the one judgment is Varke Joseph versus State of Kerala. This is an excellent judgment, AIR 1993, Supreme Court 1892. And the Honorable Supreme Court in this said that the prosecutor, this is on the criminal side, ought not to be allowed to frame questions in such a manner which the witness may answer yes or no, so as to enable him to elicit such answers which he expects or desires. It also held that allowing such leading questions would offend the right of the accused to fair trial enshrined in Article 21 of the Constitution of India. Another judgment that you might want to note down is Mohinder Singh versus State. This is a 1970 judgment, Delhi. You can find out about it. It's ILR 1970, Volume 2, Delhi 854. This is again a brilliant judgment that says that the trial judge shall not permit questions which are scandalous, vexatious, or even cantankerous, which elicit irrelevant and inadmissible answers, or even those which do not advance trial but are calculated to hinder or delay the progress. So this pertains to how the cross-examination is supposed to take place. So Please understand this, that you're not allowed to ask scandalous questions. You're not supposed to ask vexatious questions. You're not supposed to ask questions which are basically to confuse the witness. But if you think that it is going to take your case forward and the judge rejects it, then you can insist that the court notes down those questions and then says that those are disallowed. This helps you to, when you go to the higher court, to show that the questions that you needed to be asked, which you think are relevant but were not asked. I've already stated that be vigilant during the chief and when you read the affidavit, etc. There's a long-term gain that I would like to tell you to avoid a lot of mistakes. Never go without preparation. And trust the process of preparation. At times it would feel that, you're making too many notes, you're making too many of these charts, but in the long run, it is really, really going to help you. We've done some matters which were supposed to be of national importance that were in the newspaper every day. We were cross-examining witnesses after witnesses, and the stress was too high on us, on the entire team, on the other lawyers who were associated. What helped us was that when the file had come, we had started making our charts and notes. So when we were going to the court, we already had at least 50 or 60% of the preparation done beforehand. And that really helped us in preparing our cross-examination. The other thing is, any knowledge is good knowledge. So when you go to the court and you have to cross-examine a witness, a lot of times lawyers think that, we should only know about the thing that we are doing, which is law. No. It is also about articulation. It is also about knowing general law. It is also knowing basics of everything. So even if you're a jack of all, it is going to really, really help you in cross-examination. A long-term game is just read whatever you can. It doesn't really matter if it's law books, read fiction, read stories, whatever. It's really, really, really going to help you in the longer run. From there, we come to, yes, also I would suggest read section 151 and 152. We basically talk about indecent and scandalous questions and questions intended to insult or annoy. So these are the questions that you can't ask. I think it's already being dealt by the other panelists, so we will not go there. The other thing that we had to talk about is the effects of mistakes in cross-examination. Yeah. So when we talk about effects and mistakes in cross-examination, we've dealt with most of the things, but we'll quickly just kind of recapitulate what I've said. As I said, cross-examination, exploration of the truth. It is a fact-finding project. It is not a fishing expedition. It is not a rowing inquiry. You cannot ask leading questions. You cannot set yourself up to be surprised by the other side. If you ever let them give an opinion, the opinion will always go against you. If you let them explain, the explanation will always be designed to take away your victory. If you let them talk, you lost the control of time as well as the story that you're trying to put in. You should never put conclusions to the witness. One, because it's the job of the judge to conclude. Secondly, the moment you allow a witness to conclude, he gives his opinion, and his opinion may be against you. This is, of course, when you're not talking about an expert witness. Always be prepared that the other side is going to put objections and may actually try to take it on an argumentative streak. The same is designed to make sure that you lose track of your cross-examination and also to give a breather to the witness. Never ever let that happen. The moment that happens, it would be a mistake to get into an argument. You ask the witness to go out, one, or you tell the court that, my lord, we will deal with this later. Right now, the witness is there and I need to finish this cross-examination, so that you do not lose the control of the cross-examination. Again, very, very important. One thing that happens is that if you do not cross-examine the witness on a particular issue, that itself creates a lot of problems. I will give you a leading judgment and we will leave it to that. This is Lakshmi Bai, deceased through Bhagwan Thabba, and this is on non-examination on an important point, AIR 2013 Supreme Court 1204. In this, the court stated that there cannot be any dispute with respect to settled legal proposition that if a party wishes to raise any doubts as regards the correctness of the statement of a witness, the said witness must be given an opportunity to explain his statement by drawing his attention to that part of it which has been objected to by the other party as being untrue. Without this, it is not possible to impeach his credibility. Such a law has been advanced in view of the statutory provisions enshrined under Section 138 of the Evidence Act, which enable the opposite party to cross-examine a witness as regards information tendered in evidence by him during his initial examination in chief, and the scope of this provision stands enlarged by Section 146 of the Indian Evidence Act, which permits a witness to be questioned inter alia in order to test his veracity. Thereafter, the unchallenged part of his evidence is to be relied upon for the reason that it is impossible for the witness to explain or elaborate upon any doubt as regards the same in the absence of questions put to him with respect to the circumstances which indicate that the version of events provided by him is not fit to be believed and the witness himself is unworthy of credit. Importantly, thus, if a party intends to impeach a witness, he must provide adequate opportunity to the witness in the witness box to give a full and proper explanation. The same is essential to ensure fair play and fairness in dealing with the witness. Another judgment that I would like to give you again is Bhoju Mandal versus Devnath Bhagat. This is again a very important judgment. This is a very old judgment. AIR 1963, Supreme Court 1906. And this is important because what happened, the court repelled submission on the ground that the same was not put either to the witness or suggested before the courts below. Party is required to put his version to the witness. If no such questions are put, the court would presume that the witness account has been accepted. I would stop here and tell you another big mistake that is done. That you might prepare your cross-examination and you might have written down your questions. But there are three parts to any valid examination in court. One, of course, is the chief examination or the version of the other side. The other is cross-examination. And in the cross-examination, the two things are that one, you contradict the witness. You show him a previous statement and say, you had said this. Now you are digressing from it. Which version is true? Or is it correct that you had made this statement from any previous statement? The second, of course, is the cross-examination that you will put forth. The third, importantly, is the suggestions that you will put. Now, I have seen over the years, many lawyers forget to put the entire suggestion to the other side. The suggestions are putting forth your case and then the boilerplate suggestions that I put to you that you've been won over by the other side. I put to you that you've been approached by the other side. I put to you that you are not speaking the truth because of XYZ reason. I put to you that the version put before by you in such and such place was correct. The version put by you today is false, etc., etc. These are boilerplate. But the suggestions are very, very important. If you do not put those suggestions, you are actually not putting forth your case and you will be in big trouble later. So, with these judgments, with these laws and with this discussion, it is clear that the defense cannot rely, nor can the court base its finding on a particular fact or issue on which the witness has not made any statement in his examination in chief and the defense has not cross-examined him on the said aspect of the matter. Another very important point. What happens if a witness has given if the chief has been filed or chief examination has been conducted, or he has given his affidavit by way of evidence on the civil side, and then the witness has not been brought, either he's dead, he cannot be found, or for whatever reason, does not come to the court. Can his evidence be taken into account? The answer is no. Without cross-examination, that part of the evidence cannot be taken on account. Of course, there are certain exceptions and very small exceptions, but for your purpose, you should know that if that witness has not been brought for a cross-examination, his evidence that has been brought on record otherwise cannot be relied upon to base the final judgment. Now, the third point is effect of delay of cross of witnesses. Now, there are two parts of it. So, in the queries that were put to me, the query was effect and delay or cross of the accused, non-cross examination of accused. But I think what would also be important is to deal with the fact what happens if there is a delay in cross-examining the witness. Very simply, if a witness is not, if there is a delay in cross-examining the witness, usually the benefit goes to the defense. And the reason is because in criminal matters, the witness may not remember certain facts, or the witness may not, over the years, would probably, give up, will not come. A long drawn cross can also exhaust him. He might end up giving contradictory statements, etc. As I've said that, cross examination is a very tightly run ship. So depending on which side you are, you should know that what is going to happen when there is a delay in cross examining a witness. Now, the statement of a witness that is given under 161 or in examination in chief cannot be read in evidence. I've already told you that. And a judgment for you to note down for this is Asif Hussain versus State. This is a 2019 judgment of Kerala, SCC Online Kerala 1600, which said that the non-examination of material witness is against the principles of audi alteram partem. The basic principle is that you get the witness, you get his chief recorded, and then you do not get the witness for cross-examination. Can the prosecution still rely on it? The answer is no. On the civil side, again, if the affidavit has been filed, but the witness does not come, can his statement be relied upon? The answer is clearly no. Now, the other aspect of it is false evidence by witnesses. Read section 209 IPC and 340 CRPC. I'm not really going to bother you reading this, but we all understand that perjury, this is what is the effect if a witness gives a false, or the a witness gives a false information. Then we understand what perjury is. It is willfully telling the untruth or making misrepresentation under oath. Now, this is very important. Misrepresentation under oath, and I will tell you why. Because in the most basic parlance, it is lying. But in law, perjury would mean lying or making verifiably false statements under oath or affirmation in a court of law or in any of various sworn statements in writing. It is a crime because how the judicial system works is that the witness or the person who's in court is sworn to tell the truth. That is why they say on SA. And it is very important for the credibility of the court that the witness testimony should be relied upon. And if that it is tainted by falsehood, the entire structure of our judicial system, our justice system is going to fall and would cause serious miscarriage of justice. Now, legal interpretation is lying under oath, as I've already said, and I'm going to keep repeating this because whenever you go to the court, this is what the mantra would be to understand whether perjury has been committed or not. So, section 191, very, very quickly, and this is important, is giving false evidence, and I will keep pointing out where and what you have to remember. Whoever being important now, legally bound by oath or by express provision of law to tell the truth, or being bound by law to make a declaration upon any subject, important again, makes any statement which is false and which he either knows or believes to be false. So that knowledge is equally important, or does not believe to be true. So knowledge again is said to give false evidence. Now, the explanation is statement is within the meaning of this section, whether it is made verbally or otherwise, and a false statement as to belief of the person attesting is within the meaning of this section. And a person may be guilty of giving false evidence by stating that he believes the thing which he does not believe. as well as by stating that he knows a thing which he does not know. So that is why in civil law, when you file that affidavit behind every pleading, now you know why you are putting it. So therefore, what are the three requirements under 191? There is a legal obligation, there is a false statement, and there is belief or knowledge, without which a 91, it would not be perjury. So this section defines perjury as giving false evidence. It can also be a statement that has been subsequently retracted by the witness, if that retraction is also especially not due to his own volition, but due to circumstances beyond his control. So if, for example, in cross-examination, while cross-examining the witness, you make sure you brought him to a stage where he has to admit to his perjury, and he admits it. He cannot take benefit of the fact that he has admitted it, because that admission is beyond his volition. All right. Now, 193 IPC is equally important. Whosoever intentionally gives false evidence in any judicial proceeding or fabricates false evidence for the purpose of being used at any stage of a judicial proceeding shall be punishable and liable to fine and punishment for up to 7 years. So you can see how seriously the court takes this. Section 344(1) CRPC, please go through it. We will not trouble you by reading it. Section 199, false statement or a declaration which is made. Section 209, IPC, dishonesty making false claim in court. Section 340, of course, comes from 190. We will not go and read these. I'm sure the others have read it, but I'll give you a great judgment that you might need. So this is Narmada Shankar versus Dhanpal Singh. Now, in this judgment, this is AIR 2001, Supreme Court 2004. And in this judgment, which said that this was a case of malicious prosecution, the defendant or the respondent was charged under 193 IPC for having arrested the petitioner and subsequently lying under oath as to the presence of such orders. And he had to admit during cross-examination that he had previously lied about the orders. It was held that when a witness comes to the court prepared to make a false statement and makes it, but is cornered in cross-examination and compelled to admit his false statement, he cannot claim that the admission neutralizes the perjury committed by him. As I was saying, is the admission at his own volition or otherwise? The real test in all such cases was held to be whether the witness voluntarily corrected himself due to a realization of his error or genuine feeling of remorse before his perjury was exposed. There's a similar judgment, which is, again, this is a landmark judgment. Ranjit Singh versus State of Pipsu. This is AIR 1959, Supreme Court 843. So Ranjit Singh judgment 1959, Supreme Court 843. Here the accused was a police officer, was called upon to make statement against an application under Article 226 of the Constitution of India for a writ of habeas corpus, in which it was alleged that the accused had been illegally detained. Accused had illegally detained a man in police custody. In his statement, the accused, the police officer, filed false affidavit denying that the man was ever arrested by the police or was in his custody. It was held that the accused was legally bound to place the true facts before the court in his affidavit. Since the statement made by him in the affidavit was found to be false, he has committed an offense under 193 and he was punished accordingly. So these are two judgments that are going to help you make less mistakes in cross-examination. I can't say that you'll never make any mistake. We all do. But the question is to make as little mistake as possible and should always have. So another mistake that lawyers do is when they make a mistake, they zone out. And there would be amazing amount of stories on the net when you see where a lawyer has zoned out. He's just blanked out. Preparation helps you jump back on your feet. A good lawyer is one who knows even if there is a fiasco, he doesn't let it show, and he bounces back and after 5 minutes comes to the same place, revisits the same question and is able to take the answer that he wanted to rather than the answer that the witness has given to him. Right? So that is another important aspect. Now, a very important question that has been put is how much tutoring to witness be allowed and its effect. So one, we know that tutoring of witness is not allowed. On the criminal law, in fact, there's a very interesting thing that we do in cross-examination is when the investigating officer comes, we start asking him certain questions and we ask him that, would you like to, at a certain stage, would you like to, yeah, so we have gone through this. I'm sorry, I missed this. Effect of false information given by witness. And we have already spoken about the punishment. We've already spoken about the sections. There are two other judgments if you like to note it down, but the judgments that I have told you are quite comprehensive. Ramchandra judgment said that when the witness whose statement under 164 of the court was recorded but was not sticking to his statement, the court should not rebuke him nor threaten him that he will be prosecuted for perjury. This is the other side of the story. There is another thing that I wanted to talk about in this aspect is that it is all good to actually talk about cases where the judges or the court has come down heavy on a person, on a witness for making false statement, from resiling from the truth being the version of the prosecution. But that is not the absolute truth. We all understand that. The problem in India is that an investigating officer is not bound to bring the truth before the court. He is only bound to bring his version of the truth, which means that when the charge sheet is filed, he is not bound to disclose. No, there is no fair disclosure. He is not bound to give all the documents or all the evidences that he has found out, to, even if that it goes against the case of the investigating officer or of the police or of the prosecution. He is only bound to give those documents which he believes are going to take his case forward, which basically means that he is not there for a fact-finding or a truth-finding mission. He's not there to find out who is really guilty. He's only concerned about making his case stronger, which is unfair. Because till the time this happens, and this doesn't happen in UK or US, we have there, they have the law of fair disclosure. Whatever is found out, even if it goes against the prosecution case, will be filed, will be disclosed to the other side. One, it would reduce a lot of long-drawn litigation where the accused will now come on the defense side and show his case and therefore get an acquittal. You wasted the public money, you wasted public exchequer, the time of the court, and we all know how busy the courts are. Secondly, what is going to happen is a lot of times witnesses are threatened and tutored by the prosecution, and nothing really happens to the prosecution when they come and tell the court that, you know, they had to make the statement under duress, that they were pressurized into making this statement. And it is very unfair that nothing happens and there's a lot of hullabaloo about a witness supposedly resiling from the truth and making a statement in favor of the accused. He could be coming to the court, and now that he's in the mercy of the court, probably speaking the truth at that time. So what I want you to do is, for those of you who are on the criminal side, to get ahead and talk about the change that we are now required, which should be done in CRPC, that the charge sheet cannot just be a compilation of those documents and evidences that the prosecution wants to put forth, but should be those documents and those evidences which the IO has found out, and the IO is duty bound to make a fair and complete disclosure of all those documents. At the same time, we need to empower our judiciary to ask the investigating officer whether there is something else that he's hiding, and to take strict action against those police officers, those investigating officers who are not disclosing the complete truth. Why should we as lawyers be dependent on RTIs and, you know, a lot of other things that we are to do to get complete evidences out? You know, you are a single person stacked against the entire government machinery, and the machinery should be there to protect you and create a level playing field. And the level playing field is only going to happen when the police is duty bound to give fair disclosure. It is also going to reduce the number of hostile witnesses there are. I can tell you a number of cases where what has happened is that the defense has brought forth the fact that the witnesses had been tutored by the CBI or by the police. I can tell you, for example, there was in a very famous matter, uh, where what had happened was that the witnesses came to the court and said that they were tortured by CBI, that they were threatened by CBI or the prosecuting agency, and they had to therefore come and make a statement in their favor. And only when they came to the court, they could actually speak the truth and bring forth this fact before the court. So to come back, so yes, so if you want those judgments, you see, uh, what happens in the anti-Sikh riot cases. Again, I am not saying whether it's true or false. I'm only saying that when a witness, a prosecution witness comes to the court and says that he has been threatened by the prosecution or the investigating officer, I think we should hang our head in shame, because we are letting the police to do exactly what it is known to do, which is to create a case for a lot of extraneous reasons and not for the fact that they are there to find the truth, to investigate the facts and to bring forth those facts before this honorable court. So in this case, for example, in these anti-Sikh riot cases, the CBI was, it was alleged that they were tutoring key witnesses. And how it was brought forth is the defense said that the witness had given information contrary to his police statement in 1985, pointed to the fact that he was being tutored. It said that in the previous statement, he hadn't pointed towards Sajjan Kumar, subsequently pointed towards Sajjan Kumar, which basically means that he was tutored. The 2G spectrum case, very important again. This came under attack in Delhi court from two key accused, A. Raja and another one, who charged the CBI by putting pressure and tutoring the witnesses. So again, this is another case. Salman Khan hit and run case, again, very interesting. Again, as I said, that I'm not here to discuss whether this is correct or wrong. All I'm saying is that the prosecution has been alleged time and again to be threatening the witnesses. The lawyer argued before Bombay High Court that one crucial eyewitness produced by prosecution in the 2002 hit and run case has implicated the actor falsely with tutored testimony. Muslim Sheikh, who was injured and a key witness, told the magistrate in 2006 during his first trial that he had not seen anyone getting down from the car after the incident. However, Mr. Sheikh told the session court during fresh trial in 2014 that he saw the actor getting down from the car. Now, what happens when you have something as clear as this, that the witnesses have been tutored and threatened by the prosecution itself? So, unless and until we have a level playing field, there would always be questions about the witnesses either resiling from the truth or basically coming and speaking the truth for the first time in court, or being tutored by CBI, which has happened, or the police, which has happened in number of cases. So now to come back to this issue, have we? Yes, we've touched this. We've touched this. Yes. So now, how do we take care of this? So, and why should we be tutoring? Why do we end up tutoring witnesses? You see, what happens is when a witness is to come to the court, there are times that he's forgotten what the case is. There might be a requirement to refresh his memory. There may be a situation where this is a witness that has to speak on crucial facts or figures, and therefore it may be necessary to prepare your witness. There is a very thin line between preparing a witness and tutoring the witness. The courts look down upon tutoring the witness, and there are ways to find out whether the witness has been tutored or not. The difficulty is there's no record kept. I mean, so if, for example, prosecution is tutoring a witness, there is no record that on such and such date the witness was shown these documents, etc. So to eliminate discrepancies, to avoid getting embarrassing details that you do not want, and also to suppress and conceal what really happened. These are the reasons why the witnesses are usually tutored. Importantly, and I will deal with this very quickly, is courts time and again have spoken about child witnesses and how easy it is to tutor them. And there are a lot of checks and balances that have been brought in by the courts to ensure that they are not coerced or tutored, etc. Now, how do we make sure that the witnesses are not tutored? The biggest arsenal that you have is your cross-examination. A good, well-structured cross-examination to the effect that, are you prepared? And this is something that as a strategy I always use. Are you prepared? Are you prepared? I hope that you've gone through the file, right? Did you go through it today, or did you go through it in the counsel's chamber? All right. You've gone through the documents. So if I ask you questions, you will not have to go through the file again and again. What you've done is you become the friend of the other side, of the witness, and you ask him some very basic questions. There are other instances where you can, for example, in a criminal side, you will say that, so did you go to the Ayub yesterday, or did you go to him today, or did you meet him in the morning here? Things like these. So you're bringing out the fact that there has been occasions of tutoring. That is how you detect the fact that a witness is tutored. Now, what is the long-term strategy to ensure that a witness is not tutored? Is one of the best ways is to understand how the witness is reacting in court. And I've said this time and again that it is high time that we record, that we have video recording of the trial that takes place, which is kept for posterity. Once you're in appeal, etc., you can always revisit the recording of the trial. And you can also show to the court, the appellate court, that look at the conduct, look at the demeanor, look at how he's reacting, etc., to show whether the witness has been tutored or not tutored. Now, I've already talked about video conference, video recording. I've already talked about the other aspect. Child witnesses, again, time and again, the courts have stated that in child witnesses, you have to be very, very careful. You should ensure that that he's not tutored, and that he has been given situationally, he should be put in comfort. Couple of judgments for you, should you like to note it down, is one, which is a landmark judgment, is Panchi versus State of UP, 1998, volume 7, SCC 177. And it said that the child is an easy prey of tutoring. Nevertheless, his evidence cannot be rejected. If he is found reliable, his evidence must be evaluated more carefully and with greater circumspection. I'm sorry, my mouth would be, I'm a little tired, I guess. The other is Ratan Singh versus State of Gujarat. Again, this is AIR 1994, Supreme Court's 1068, which stated a child witness are amenable to tutoring and often live in a world of make-believe. Though it is an established principle that child witness are dangerous witness, they are pliable and liable to be influenced easily, shaped and molded, but it is also accepted norm that if after carefully scaling their evidence, the court comes to the conclusion that there is an impression of truth in it, then there is no obstacle in the way of accepting the evidence of the child witness. So this concludes this point of discussion. Now, to discuss the importance of 313, a very, very important step when in criminal trial, a very, very important step. This ensures the principle of natural justice. It allows the accused to come and speak his version to the court. Though 313 says that a judge may at any stage without previous warning to the accused put such questions to him as the court considers necessary. But what is usually done, 99.9% is the other part B, shall after the witness for the prosecution have been examined and before he is called on for his defense, question him generally on the case, provided that in a summons case where the court has dispensed with the personal attendance of the accused, it may also dispense with his examination under clause B. And third, no oath shall be administered to the accused when he is examined under subsection 1. The accused shall not render himself liable to punishment by refusing to answer such questions or by giving false answers to them. This enables the accused to explain the incriminating circumstances against him. So basically, after the prosecution evidence is concluded, the judge puts specific questions as to the case against him. This is the case which has been developed by the prosecution through the trial. It may be different from what the charge sheet is, or it may follow the lines of the charge sheet. But the fact is that this is what the judge is going to say are the circumstances against you on which I am going to base my finding. What do you have to say? In the olden era, and the times gone by, you could get away by just saying it is false, it is false, it is false. The courts now do not like it. So the law has changed and we'll deal with it. But there are certain pointers that you may want to remember about 313. This comes after the prosecution evidence is concluded. All the circumstances against the accused are put in question form to the accused, who then has to answer the same. Over the years, the law has really developed, and now it has gained much importance, and therefore you should prepare for your 313, because that is where your defense is also going to be based upon. Because this is the first time a concrete defense is put by the accused to the court, and therefore thereafter he leads the case. If he's refused to answer a question, though the law says it cannot be used against him, but this is also a circumstance that the appellate courts in a lot of judgments have seen. Important point is that each and every incriminating circumstance has to be put to the accused. Failure of that may, in the olden days, vitiate the entire trial. Now the laws have changed, because the court says that at appellate stage, the court can still, under the first part of 313, ask those questions and see whether there has been a miscarriage of justice or not. And that is your mantra, whether there has been a miscarriage of justice or not. So there is a judgment, Sharad Vedi Chand. There is another judgment which is one of my favorite, which is Ashraf Ali versus State of Assam. This is a 2008 judgment, volume 16, SCC 328. And this judgment said that every circumstance appearing against the accused must be put to him specifically and separately. Failure to do so would vitiate the trial if the accused is shown to be prejudiced thereby, or it resulted in miscarriage of justice. This was a case under 302 IPC. It was held that the trial is vitiated and acquittal was directed. This is how the law was. The law, as I said, has changed here. There is another judgment which is actually older than this, but the courts now actually rely on this judgment and what emanates from it more. This is Shobhit Chamar versus State of Bihar, AIR 1998, Supreme Court 1693. It was held that mere improper or defective examination under 330 is no ground for setting aside the accusations placed against the accused, unless argument of prejudice is shown and is provided. Unless an examination of accused is conducted in a perverse way, there can be no prejudice against the accused. So this is the law which is supposed to be better now, which is now being followed. The question is, what if under 313 the accused refuses to answer the question? He says that I refuse to answer the question. I will not answer this question. So there's a judgment for you. This is Fulla Singh, again a landmark judgment, versus State of Himachal Pradesh. It was held that the accused has the right to remain silent and not answer, or even remain in complete denial during examination under section 313 CRPC. However, such silence and denial would be read against him. So this is what the law is. I've already read Ashraf Ali. This is again one of my favorite. Every inculpatory material has to be put to him and explained to him. That is what the understanding of law is. And therefore, if you are on the defense side, you will, and you're on the trial side, you will make sure that The answers are given to every statement that is made, every incriminating circumstance, and the judgment does not wave away from the questions put under 313. So you'll make a list of 313 and you'll keep marking the judgment to see if the judge has gone beyond the questions or the circumstances put under 313. So unless great prejudice is shown to have been caused to the accused, the appellate court will not usually reverse the finding of guilt. The appellate court can even ask questions under 313 at appellate stage to see if there is any miscarriage of justice. We've already dealt with that. To go beyond it, yeah. So I think we've dealt with the major aspects of it. Now I will generally talk about the general aspects. Yes, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can speak.
All right. All right. How much time do we have now?
Sir, it's upon you only. We have full time. We are there, and we will be asking. We are allowing the participant to ask you question. To as much time as you want. We are open for that.
All right. But what we'll do is I'll just give some pointers, and I think there are too many judgments and too many laws generally, which I'm sure would have been dealt by others as well. So to give you pointers from my experience as to what is required and what is not required. Yes, so there are two other judgments that I would like you to see. One is Sanatam Naskar. This is an AIR 2010 Supreme Court judgment 3507. And it said that not only does it enable the court to question the accused, but it also enables the accused to personally enter into a dialogue with the court to show his innocence. You see what happens, there's a huge difference when the accused himself comes and puts forth his story. And this is what the purpose of 313 is. Another judgment that you might want to note down is AIR 2000 Supreme Court 34214. It said that as a general rule, it was mandatory for the accused to be personally present in the court to answer questions under 313. It was further stated that if he remains present in court personally that created undue hardship, then it may also dispense with such examination even in warrant case. This is an exception to the rule. We all know that in criminal trial, the presence of the accused is must, and he is exempted only in very special circumstances, not usually. Two other judgments that you may want to note down is 1973 AIR 2622. And here, this is a 3-bench judgment. And this is what happens when a circumstance is not put forth. As I have already stated, that every inculpatory material has to be put forth to enable the accused to explain it. If he doesn't explain it, though 313 says will not be read against him, but the courts have been not very kind to such accused. The other judgment is again noted right there, 2006 Criminal Law Journal NOC 45. The recording of statement of accused persons simultaneously and putting the same set of questions to the other accused persons may create prejudice against the accused. Hence, the court held that this practice has to be deprecated. This concludes at least the entire
basic explanation
that we had. I'm just trying to get out of this while I'm talking to you. How do you stop sharing the screen? Thank you. Yes, I finally understood. So just quickly, before you ask questions, something I would like to tell you from my personal experiences that you might require. When you formulate your questions, try to get those questions, and this is really boring, that try to get your questions in a yes, where the answers can only be yes, no, I don't know. I understand this doesn't sound very exciting, because when, the whole idea of the art of cross-examination is that, you got something, it's like, you're getting a rabbit out of a hat. It usually doesn't happen. It usually doesn't happen, and it might happen in some lucky streak where you might get a witness who's just eating out of your hand. But usually doesn't happen. So get your questions in yes, no fashion. The moment you get them in yes-no fashion, it will be easier for you to formulate the entire structure. Second, always and always write down your suggestions. Your suggestions would be, again, long game, short game. Long game suggestion would be of the entire case, and short game would be pertaining to that witness. Third, very importantly, know the basics of exhibiting documents and the law of hearsay, etc. A lot of trials I have seen, when matters come to us on the appellate stage, we realize that the lawyers in the lower court had somehow not asked certain questions, or had failed to object in certain issues, and which created a lot of problems. Cross-examination can be learned from books. It can be learned from statutes. It can be learned from understanding of law. But the art of cross-examination is different from the science of cross-examination. The art of cross-examination can only be learned when you are day in and day out in court, and if you have the good fortune of sitting in some matters where you've seen some good cross-examination happen. The art of cross-examination is putting the science of cross-examination into effect. It is preparing so much. It is reading so much that when you go to the court, it all sounds naturally. You are never perturbed. You can get your witness, you can get your bearing when you think that the witness has asked something which he shouldn't have asked, and you get your bearing before the witness has realized it. That it's the fastest finger usually wins in the court. And just to conclude, if anybody ever says that you cannot learn the art of cross-examination, I remember the words of somebody very famous who said that, I'm very lucky, and I realize the harder I work, the luckier I get. And that's exactly what your understanding of cross-examination should be. The more you work at it, the better you will be at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And we are now open for the questionnaires. So please, any person who want to ask question directly from the sir, just raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can ask question from the sir. So first of all, let the people. Saurav has. So Saurav, I am unmuting you.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, Saurav, you are. Please.
Yes, sir. This question is regarding preparation and tutoring. So
Yes.
So the question is, if I am with my witness and I'm sitting with him for the preparation, and if I tell him that these questions can be asked in your cross, so be prepared to answer this question. So is this tutoring or is this preparation?
So this is clearly preparing. But if you tell him that, this question is asked, this is how you're supposed to answer, or say that I don't remember, that would be tutoring. Right?
Okay.
So, see, a witness, of course, will come prepared to the court. The question is whether you are helping him prepare or whether you are tutoring him is what the question is the catchphrase here. As lawyers, we avoid letting the witness say in court that he went and met the lawyer and he read the file, etc., which is the practical aspect of it. But the other practical aspect of it is that a witness will not really remember what happened 3 years down the line. So either if he doesn't have the copy of the file, he has the right to come and read, right?
Another is Pushkar. I am unmuting you. You can ask the question to sir. Pushkar.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Sir, what is your strategy when you feel that the judge has made up a mind for conviction?
This is not an ambit of cross-examination, is it? But at what stage do you think that he's made up his mind for conviction?
Sir, I have observed certain trials and it becomes apparent from the questionnaire of 313 that the judge is pretty much convinced that the man is a criminal.
Okay, so understand this. I'm glad you asked this question. I'm really glad. Pushkar, understand this, that the 313 is designed to put every case against you. Every trial that you see, the question that the judge is going to put in 313 is always going to be as if he is going to convict you. He is giving you the opportunity to explain the circumstances against you, right?
Okay.
So merely by going through the questions in 313, never presume that he's, hanging you, that he's against you. It is that, this is what the prosecution has said is against you. What do you have to say?
Okay, thank you, sir.
Next question is from Preeti. Preeti, I am unmuting you. Preeti, please unmute yourself.
Audible,
Yes.
sir?
Yes, you are,
Audible,
Preeti.
Good morning, sir. Sir, my question is first is how to cross in cyber related cases where we are not sure about whether the accused is doing such a keyboard typing or whatever the things related to the cyber. Second is जब हम कोई भी evidence by way of evidence मोबाइल प्रिंट आउट देते हैं या पीसी प्रिंट आउट, तो कुछ टाइम के बाद वो ब्लर हो जाती है एविडेंस, चाहे हमारे पास रहे या कोर्ट में रहे. द मेन सोर्स इज मोबाइल. सपोज हमारा मोबाइल जो है वो इतना स्मार्ट नहीं हो और कुछ दिन के बाद वो खराब हो जाए, तो उस सिचुएशन को कैसे कोप आउट करेंगे इन क्रॉस एग्जामिनेशन में, चाहे चीफ एग्जामिनेशन में, सर?
All right. So this is very issue-centric fact, but let me give you a very answer that would be a little more generalized. We all understand that when it comes to cyber law, IT Act comes into play. We are also aware that the judgment of the Supreme Court that says that an affidavit under 65B will be given, right? The affidavit under 65B basically says that the person who's filing that evidence, the electronic record, had that evidence in his exclusive possession, that the computer was only used by him, that he's aware of the technology, that he took out the printout, etc., etc. That is what the purpose of 65B is. Now, when an evidence is filed in court, if it gets faded over time, if it gets, whatever, destroyed by efflux of time, the fact is that that evidence has been filed. Now that original of that evidence will also be there in a data disk. So what is it called? I think the master data disk, right? So that master data disk will also be there. That master data disk can be also opened and operated, and the evidence will be there, coupled with the fact that 65 statement is there, which says that Fala, this was the witness who's taken out, and he basically is owning to the pedigree of that evidence, is going to be how is going to validate that evidence. That is one. How to cross-examine a cyber witness. So one would, of course, you will go through the parameters of 65B. That is the very basic of cross-examination, that whether you had the exclusive control and right over the hardware, are you aware of the software, etc., etc. The second part of it is, I would strongly suggest you that depending on the case that you have, get a cyber expert to help you, because he will be able to find out and tell you the loopholes that are there in the case, or in the opinion given, or in the report of the prosecution, etc., etc. So, as I said, get one smart guy to fight against the other smart guy. For an expert on one field, get another expert on the other field. In expert cases, get an expert to help you out.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Rishabh, I am unmuting you, Rishabh.
Yeah.
Good morning, sir. So this is Rishabh. My question is, can one discredit the credibility of an expert witness? If yes, then how?
Can one discredit the credibility of an expert witness? Is that the question, Rishabh?
Yes, sir. This is the question. Yes, sir.
All right. All right. You see, how do you handle an expert witness? The Supreme Court on various courts has stated that an opinion of an expert witness is merely an opinion, and if it goes against the facts or the documents of the case, the documents and that evidence would be more credible over the opinion of a witness, of an expert witness. Always remember that. That is one. Second, the only way you can destroy an expert witness is by destroying the credibility of his opinion. And how do you destroy the credibility of his opinion? For example, let us talk about a handwriting expert. I mean, something that comes day in and day out. The handwriting expert comes and says that, I've seen the way the R's are rolled, I've seen how the T is crossed, etc., etc., and therefore I can say that the writing A is done by the same person who has done writing B, for example. Now, your expert witness, somebody that you have taken help from, can help you say that please tell us the indenture marks, please tell us the flow of the writing, please tell us what is, so for example, there are various technologies, there is a spectrometer, there is a variable meter, there is a Vibgyor meter, etc., etc. So these basically see the color, the formation, the depth of the signature or the handwriting, etc. So when you know these questions, and you ask these questions, you start digging loopholes in the opinion of the expert witness. And the moment you do that, then the only thing that the court has now to rely upon is the established document which is there on record. And the Supreme Court has said time and again, if there are two stories, and that is why I said that if you're a litigation lawyer, you're a good storyteller, irrespective whether on the civil side or the criminal side. And a lot of court, and over the years I've realized this, that you might have a weaker case, but you have a story that is more believable. And judges are also human beings. If a judge feels, deep in his heart, that what you are saying, that your client is innocent, and there were intervening circumstances, that the judge is not going to let the law come in the way of justice mostly. Mostly. I mean, if the law is very, very clear, nothing much can happen. But the fact is that if there is a leeway, the court is going to grant you that leeway. If there are two stories equally credible, one that favors the accused will always be taken. That is what the Honorable Supreme Court has stated. And the judges also, as I said, judges are human beings. We've done cases where, so I was doing a case of a very big neta. And when I went to the court, and I had a judge, a very, very good judge, in my personal opinion, a very, very intelligent judge. But the first thing she said is, Mr. Sankla, how can you say this? Your client has done this. And I said that, my lord, we've come to you for the first time. I read it in the newspaper. And 4 or 5 things she said I read in the newspaper. And it was after half an hour or 45 minutes, I just said that, would my lord base her opinion on what has been stated in the newspaper? And she smiled and she realized that she made a mistake. And she said, no, I did not mean that. And then she gave us enough leeway, because what she did was she cleaned her slate. She realized that the case is very big. It's coming in newspapers every day, it's there in media. But she cleaned her slate, and then she went and took the prosecution to task, because she realized the loophole that the media is not really talking about. So that is what I'm saying. If you have a case, you bring forth that case, the court is going to appreciate you. Yeah, anything else?
Okay, sir. And next question is Ayushi. You can ask the question from sir. Ayushi.
Hello, sir. Good morning.
Hi, Ayushi.
In the beginning, you had said that there are 3 versions of a story: your story, my story, and the absolute truth. So obviously, your witnesses have to be in consonance with your story. So now it becomes pertinent to tutor the witness. Now, at this moment, it is important to make the witness also to prepare the witness also that that he is not that the defense cannot find out that he is being tutored. How to do that? Hello.
I didn't really understand the question. I'm sorry, your voice was going, but I understand that you're saying that on the point that I said that there are 3 sides to every story.
Yeah. So your witness should be in consonance with your story. So how, like, it is pertinent that we tutor him, we prepare him, because as you said that there are 3 versions. Your story.
So understand this. Okay, so this is one of my favorite dialogues or sayings, that there are 3 sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. I say this in court also quite often. There are 3 sides to every coin. Of course, head, tail, and something in middle. And when I say that, what I really mean is that I said that map is not a territory. It basically means that every fact that has happened has been filtered by the experience, opinion, and the thought process of the viewer. Everything that you've seen, I mean, if there's an accident that takes place and 10 people are standing right there looking at that accident, 10 of them would have different versions of it. And those versions would also be dependent on what has been the past experience of that person. It would also be dependent on their socio-economic condition. It could also be affected on what they're thinking, whether they slept well last night or not. So the versions change according to the witness. Please understand this. And we are not saying that you tutor a witness because you're making him lie. What you are saying is that you are making sure that the witness is in consonance with the broader picture that you're bringing forth before the court. For example, as I said, there's a case about accident. You don't want the witness to come and say कि आज मैंने सुबह क्या खाया था and then day before yesterday what happened and waste the time of the court. You want him to come to the exact point, and you want to make sure that the witness has seen what you or your client believes that has happened or not. Right? So you're not tutoring him. You're preparing the witness कि these are the questions, do not digress. This is what the issue is, this is what the moot point is, because the witness doesn't know. You as a lawyer know. You're not going to waste the time of the court. The court is going to come down very heavy on you if your witness is not even prepared and he's rambling on and on. Understand that poor judge. I have a lot of friends who are now on the other side of the bar, so to say. And when we talk about informally, most of them laugh and say that when you're sitting there, you realize how boring lawyers are, how they can ramble on and we can't do anything about it. At times a lot of judges are thinking, please shut up. You've already proved your point. Why are you going on and on? It is not only helping you, it is helping that poor judge out there who has 75 or 78 matters to do in a day. You're saving his time also. He could be doing something fruitful at that time, get some other logical witness. So that is preparation. Tutoring is when you're telling him, aap ye bol dena. That's tutoring. Preparing is ki no, this does not, it doesn't matter what you had last night. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that you have, some physical ailment. Please come to the point. This is what you're supposed to say. Thank you. And then get out.
So next question is from Naman. Naman, am I unmuting you, please?
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for accepting my request. I'm Naman. I'm a second-year law student, sir. And I have 2 questions, and I will conclude my questions in next 30 seconds. My first question is how to handle. I participated in one mock trial competition.
Okay.
My question is how to handle continuous objections. Like they break your flow. And I don't know how to control, how to handle. Should we lash out at the learned counsel, or should we complain to the judge? And my second question is how to write a good closing and opening statement.
How to write a closing and opening statement.
Good closing and opening statement.
Naman, I will be very honest with you. I have never ever participated in a mock trial when I was a young lawyer. I actually, what I did was I joined a lawyer in the first semester. And fortunately, he was a CBI special counsel. And so I had a lot of experience on the practical side. By the time I passed out of law, I already had 2.5 years of experience. I stayed with that lawyer for another, I think, 3.5 years. So I had 6 years of the same chamber, which a lot of young lawyers don't really do. It is unfortunate. You tend to shift from one lawyer to another after 1 year. In 1 year, I would not trust my junior. It's after 1 year I would start thinking I'll give him juicier matters. So one stick around. But coming back to your question, when an objection is raised, you can do 2 things. You can act if the objection is relevant. You take the permission of the court to answer. The moment you take the permission of the court, you have also made sure that the judge is looking at you. And when the judge is looking at you, he will also make sure that next objection do not come unnecessarily. So you have now the protection of the court. You'll say, my lord, an objection has been raised, with your permission, I would like to tell my learned counsel and you answer the query. The second is, if there are too many objections, you take the indulgence of the court and you tell them that, my lord, I would like to meet them later, because right now I'm cross-examining my witness and my cross-examination would otherwise get diverted. We will be wasting the precious time of the court. The third thing that you can do, which I have done once or twice, and this is actually a very, I don't even know whether I should be sharing it with you or not. But if you really want to irritate the other side and you have a friend or a colleague sitting, you ask him, please note down all your objections and we'll answer them when we think they are important. And after he's noted down, ignore them and go ahead with your matter. But don't do that too often. Don't do that too often. Do it only if you know the other side is hell-bent on irritating you. Opening statement. You see, in court, there is nothing called an opening statement, but there is a closing statement. So I will tell you how to make a good close, how I make it. I will tell you how I make my closing statement. And it's a very standard operating procedure, how I do it. I take the entire case against me and I chunk it down into points. Then at every point, I find out what the section is, the statute, and a judgment to that effect. Once I have that, I mold my argument or my statements. I mix the fact and the statute and the judgment, and then I basically argue, or I give my closing argument. How that helps me is that the court, even if the court has made up its mind, the court is bound by either the law or the interpretation of the law, which is by the Honorable Supreme Court or the High Court. So even if the court has made up its mind, when you say that, my lord, another point against me is such and such, or when you say that, my lord, as alleged such and such, which has already been dealt with by the Honorable Supreme Court in such and such, you made the judge know that there is a case point which is in your favor, and therefore even if the court has made up its mind, it will now have to revisit that thought process. The second important thing is, if there is a statute or a section completely in your favor, you say that, my lord, an allegation or a statement to this effect is there. My lord is aware that section such and such clearly states. You never ever teach the court. Again, there are a lot of judges who teach the court. There are a lot of lawyers who teach the court. I have a different strategy. When I started 20 plus years back, I was a very aggressive lawyer. But over the years, I befriended a lot of judges who were kind enough to, and that was also the golden era where judges were kind enough to talk to you as human beings. Once a judge told me, which I took to heart, was they said that, Kapil, you can pull an order from the court by your aggression. But when judges sit together, they talk about lawyers, etc., etc. At times that aggression will go against you. If you want the discretion of the court, you should change your strategy. Argue more on law, less on fact, and be humble. And I actually noticed some of the top lawyers in India, and I've had the good fortune of briefing them or being with them, they are seldom aggressive. They are seldom tutoring the court. In fact, Rani Palkiwala in a wonderful case stated that I keep my strongest point for the last. And once I've given all the points and the judges said, no, Mr. Palkiwala, nothing doing Mr. Palkiwala, then I turn and say, my lord, there was one small point. I don't even know whether it is important. And then I give that point. And then the judge says, this is the point we were looking for, Mr. Palkiwala. You should have said this point and say that, my lord, is my lord's indulgence. You make the judge feel important. The judge is going to be with you. The other is, as a closing statement coming back, is you never tutor the judge. You always say, and as my lord is aware, and you give whatever point there is. The judges are usually never that prepared as prepared you are, because they're going through so many cases and you've already got your fees for one case and you're preparing for it. So be with the court and the court is going to be with you. That is my advice to you when it comes to closing statements. Anything else?
Question is coming from Sumit. Sumit, the last we will be taking. Sumit Saban. Sumit, are you taking my voice?
Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are good. Please
Yeah,
tell me.
good morning, sir. My question is, how would you conduct a cross-examination of an eyewitness whom you know that he is not a true eyewitness, and how to discredit his statement?
Could you give a little more specific, or shall I just give you a very general answer?
Say, for example, you come across various cases where the eyewitnesses are not true eyewitnesses.
Okay.
And how to discredit them in your cross-examination?
Okay, wonderful. One great idea that you have, as I said, go and visit the site.
Okay.
Once you visit the site, you know more about the site than the witness who has never been to the site does.
Okay.
He's an eyewitness to a particular incident, right?
Yeah.
For example, let's talk about a small case. Let's talk about a small case. Let's talk about an accident case. Let's talk about an overspeeding case. Very, very basic. Somebody says that the car was going in a very rash and negligent manner in extreme speed, and he crossed the red light and the accident took place, etc., etc. I did a matter like this many, many years back. And you have witnesses to that effect. Now you visited that site. For example, at 3 o'clock, you visit the site and you realize that at that particular day, and in those days, that's a road which has a huge vehicular traffic. So the cars cannot really travel very fast. I mean, the speed has to be slow. You also realize that, there was a zebra crossing, and the witness and the person who's injured really did not use that zebra crossing, but was crossing the road from the middle of the road. Or that there was an underpass or an overpass and that was not utilized. So you understand where I'm leading you?
Yes.
So the moment you've gone to the site, you know a bit more than the other side has. And you have your phone, you make your video and you keep it with you. And so then when you're about to cross-examine that witness, you've seen that site again, you refresh your memory. The witness will never be that prepared. That is one. Second, a lot of times on the criminal side, these witnesses could also be stock witnesses. So it is your job to find out whether these are stock witnesses. If you know that these are stock witnesses, it's very easy to discredit their testimony. Because that man has to be a wonderfully law-abiding citizen who somehow is always there in the right place for a particular thana. And he probably is there a witness in 30 matters or 20 matters. The moment you say that as a stock witness, no judge is going to believe his evidence at all.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
More question? Anyone interested? Any more question can raise his hand. As we will ask sir. Sir, his thought has already gone to some extent. So we'll ask sir to have rest on that part. Thank you very much, sir. It
Thanks
was
a lot.
really an amazing session, sir. And we request to join us into the closing session also for 1 hour.
Of course, if possible, I would definitely be there. Thank you. It's been
okay, sir. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you for calling. Bye-bye.
Sir has left, and I request you all that we will be joining again at 12:30, right? At 12:30, the same. Thank you very much. I'm ending the